Welcome to DOM manipulation and events. Let's just start off by doing regular DOM manipulations. So I'm gonna create a folder here. I guess we'll just call it DOM manipulation, and we'll cd into that. And I'm just gonna create an HTML file for us to create some HTML. I'll create an app.js file where we'll write some JavaScript to select stuff from the HTML. I'm going to run light server to basically just run both of these files. Right now there's nothing in the HTML file, so we're not going to see anything there. And then I'll open up Atom so we can start working with these files. So this is just basic HTML setup. We'll call this DOM manipulation. And in the body, I'll add a header and a main where we'll write some code. So let's actually, you know what? I'm gonna get rid of the header. Just write everything in the main. So we'll do a h1 with the class of title, and we'll call it. We'll put DOM manipulation in here. So ultimately what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a bunch of HTML elements on the page here, and then I'll show you guys in JavaScript how there's a bunch of different ways that you can select nodes on the DOM. And what the DOM itself is essentially when you write your HTML, it's essentially just like one long string, right? It's just a big long string of code. What happens when that code gets loaded into the browser? What it does is it creates the DOM. So the DOM is a few things at once. It's a way for you, it's an API, application programming interface, which essentially is just like a bunch of ways that you can access the HTML. So we have a bunch of methods in JavaScript, a bunch of functions in JavaScript that let us like select different pieces of the HTML so that we can do stuff with them. It's also sort of renders out this like tree structure, so kind of like renders out a tree with like a bunch of different nodes on it, and we can then like select like each of these being sort of the hierarchy that we see in our code. So pretend like this is like the body, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 elements in the body, and then each of those has an element inside of it. This is kind of how the DOM works. So it's at the same time, it's like a way to interact with our code once it's rendered on the page, and it's this tree structure thing. DOM itself stands for Document Object Model. So it takes our code, which is just a string, and it renders it out into both what you see on the page and how we can manipulate what we see on the page with programming. So let's just like we'll create some code here. We have an h1, that's a pretty typical thing to start with. Let's do a section. Inside of that section, we can have maybe like an h2, first section. Inside of here, maybe we have a couple paragraphs. I'm going to use Bacon Ipsum. You guys heard of this? It's basically, so like lorem ipsum is just like kind of that default generic text that you see in like mockups and stuff like that. Bacon Ipsum will generate basically just like filler stuff with all like meat, like spicy jalapeno bacon ipsum dolor. So there's a bunch of different like ipsum generators. I like Bacon Ipsum a lot. There's a Samuel L. Jackson Ipsum one that's pretty funny. Yeah, there's Hipster Ipsum. There's a Star Wars one.
And there's a Lord of the Rings one.
All right, cool. So, all right, awesome. Let's do our first. Our first section will be bacon and meat. I'll just change that to and. And we'll do another section below it. We'll do an H2 in here as well. We'll call this one Star Wars, and we'll generate some Star Wars ipsum for this one. Do another p tag in here. Let's see, Star Wars ipsum. Yeah, nice. Just do one paragraph. Jedi Grandmaster sounds good to me. Cool. Nice. So we'll grab that, throw that into our HTML. It's a paragraph. And ultimately what we have on our page now is nothing. There we go. So I'll zoom out a little bit. So we just have our H1, our big H1 at the top. Then we have a couple sections here. They each have an H2 and a paragraph. So when the DOM is actually rendering, we're starting off, like this first node that we had was the body. Then, I need an eraser. Then we have two nodes that are coming off of that. So we have two sections, right? Each one of these is a section. And then coming off of each of those sections, we have an H2 and a P. So we have, let me redraw this. We have an H2 here and here, and we have a P. So this is basically just like a tree gets rendered based on like what is the parent and the child of other elements in the DOM. I actually should have drawn, this is actually the main here. And then the body is up top, right? Because the body has one direct descendant, and that's the main. The main has two direct descendants. Those are both sections. Oh, and H1. And then each of those sections has two direct descendants, an H2. Each one has an H2 and a P. So this is kind of how the DOM works. So however many elements you have, HTML elements you have on the page, and however deeply nested they are, that's kind of how they get rendered out. And it's kind of a way of like visualizing how the code is working. So there are a number of different ways using JavaScript we can navigate through this DOM tree and select different nodes. And then once we have a node selected, we can do different things with it. So I'm going to actually go ahead and add one more section. We'll use another ipsum. We'll do the hipster ipsum. So it'll just be the same structure as this one, or as the other two, I should say. Each one has an H2, each one has a P, and we'll grab some text for them. Hipster ipsum is pretty funny. All right, one paragraph. Sweet. So if we go back to our page, now we have these three sections. Now, we got to link in our JavaScript file. So we need to, when you link in your JavaScript file, you really want to put it at the bottom of your body. It's sort of a best practice because the DOM needs to be like created and loaded in the browser before your script gets loaded. And because if you have your script up at the top, some people put theirs in the head, or you could put it at the top of the body. You could technically put it like pretty much anywhere. But if you put it above where the actual HTML elements are loading up, then your script is going to run before the DOM exists. So anything you're doing that's trying to manipulate the DOM, select things from the DOM, add event listeners to things on the DOM, it can't happen because it doesn't exist yet. So your whole script will run before the DOM is loaded if you put it in the head or at the top of the body. And ultimately your script, if it's doing DOM selection or DOM manipulation, is just not going to do anything. So there is a function that you can wrap your entire script in that makes it wait for the DOM to be loaded. We'll get into that probably more later in the week. For now, and even when you're using that function, it's the best practice to just put your script at the bottom and then you don't have to worry about it. So in order to link this script, my app.js file is in the same level folder-wise as my index.html, so I'm just going to do /app.js. That will link in the file. And just to test it, I'm just going to put a little console log. Just do working. No. All right, so now if we go back to our site, we open up the DevTools Command-Option-J, we have a console log. So our script is linked. And now we can do some selection of elements. So there are a number of different ways you can select elements. It's usually best to store the results in a variable because that makes it easier to work with later in your script. So let's do var. We have this h1 with the class of title. We'll do var title equals document. All of these methods start with document because we want to select the whole document, and then we're going to call a method on the document that will search for the appropriate node. We can do, if you even just type in get, you see we've got a bunch of snippets for selecting selecting the DOM in different ways. The one I'm going to use here is get elements by class name. And what this does is it's a function, it's a method on the document object that we can pass in an argument, and what it's expecting here as the snippet has populated is the name of the class of the element that we want. So in this case we have an h1 with the class of title. So if we throw title in here, we will be grabbing all elements on the page with the class of title. For this particular example, we only have one element with the class title, but since it's searching for all elements, even when there's only one, what's going to return from this isn't actually an array. So kind of the good rule of thumb is if you're using a method that says get elements with the S, then that's going to return an array. So if we do a console log and we log out the title here, and I'm just throwing this text in. If you console log two things or many things separated by a comma, it'll log them both with a space between them. So this is just to be clear that this is the title. How about let's do title elements. And if we go back to our page, you see we have title elements, and it is an array. It's an array of length 1. The thing that's in it at index 0 is this h1.title. So that's element h1 with the class of title. So if we want to just manipulate that one element, what we need to do, since this is an array, we just access the first index of the array. Actually, I meant to put that up here. So now what's contained in title is specifically just this first element within the DOM. So, or the first h1 element, I should say. So now when we see the log of title elements, we see it's this h1 class title. It's essentially just the HTML that we wrote, right? So we're accessing this node on the DOM, and what's returning from our JavaScript is the actual HTML. So we can now do stuff with this. Like we can append more HTML to it. We can change the style of it. There's a whole host of things that we can do with it. So a pretty common thing that you might want to do is say change some of the styling. So now we have this stored properly in a variable. So I'm going to get rid of this console log. We can now do title dot style let's change like the color. And so all we're doing here is we're chaining methods, we're chaining functions together. So we've stored this node on the DOM in this variable title that has we can access the style attribute on it. We can access the color attribute from there, and we can set it equal to, let's say, red. So now when we reload our page, the h1 with the class of title is turned red. So you can basically do anything that you can do with CSS by doing this like style dot and then the name of the attribute that you want to change. If it's an attribute like background color, if it's basically any CSS attribute where there's normally like a dash in the rule that you would do in CSS, instead of doing a dash in your JavaScript, you do camel case, which is, so like for background color, instead of background dash color, we leave out the dash and you just make the first letter of the second word, or if it's multiple words, you capitalize the first letter. So if we do, let's just do green. So now if we go back, we see that this whole element has a background color of green as well. So let's see what we can do with some of these other sections here.
So like, kind of like, you don't really need CSS. Like, is there more advanced things you can do with CSS that you couldn't necessarily do from here in the DOM?
You can pretty much do anything you could do with CSS through DOM manipulation. It's really nice to have some basic styling at least, because it can be like, this is a little bit more verbose than writing out like CSS rules, but you can change just about anything. This is a pretty like contrived example, but like you could imagine a button on a site that like changes color schemes, and when you click on it, it applies like a whole host of styles to the page, and maybe goes from like a dark theme to a light theme to a dark theme, or vice versa, or gives you some options you can select and then changes colors. Some of the power of DOM manipulation comes when you are working with like an external API or like a back end where you can like request some information from it and then like make a search for whatever. Like even like, think about how Google works. At first you just have like a search bar, you type stuff in, it then returns results from a database and like adds them to the page, right? So in addition to changing CSS styles, we can append things, which is essentially adding them onto the page. We can create new nodes on the DOM. So we could say have a site that just has like we could have a fourth section on this site that's just empty. And based on some sort of user input or making a search, requesting some data from somewhere else on the web, we could get that data back and then populate that section with a new title and a new paragraph and maybe some pictures or something like that. So it's essentially anything you want to do to make your website more dynamic, rather than just like, this is what it is and this is what it looks like and that's all it's ever going to look like and all it's ever going to be. DOM manipulation, events, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and all the cool stuff you can do with JavaScript is essentially adding like a dynamic element to websites, web apps, so that they're not just static. They don't just like render in the page and there they are, and that's kind of all they can do. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with CSS with animations. So you could have like, we'll probably do a breakout on CSS animations sometime, maybe next week, because we're doing like design stuff next week. But like you could have, say when a user scrolls down the page to a certain point, paragraphs or images start like sliding in from the left and the right. Then when you scroll up, they fade away. Or you hit a button and, or say it's like a blog or something, and you want to display pieces of the blog, but you don't necessarily want to show the whole post. You could have a button or link that says read more, and when you click that, the rest of the post loads up. You can do a whole host of things.
Is this how you would get like a scrolling navigation bar where you've got like the links of what you want to see on the page, and when you click on it, it's just going to like scroll the page to
that spot? You can do that with this. You can also do that with anchor tags, okay, which are essentially like links on the page that just reference a certain part of the page. Basically. Yeah. Okay. So you can put well, I'll show you this page. Yeah, this will probably work. So usually anchor tags are used to like link to another page, right? But if I put a tag in here, yeah, you know what? I'm forgetting the exact syntax. I think what you need to do is do it with IDs. So let's just call this one section 3, or we'll give it the idea of hipster section. How about that? And then if you have the reference for this link be the ID of hipster section. We'll put this, I'm not sure if this is how it works actually. Let's see what happens though. We'll put this up here. I think what you actually need to do is you have like another A tag down here that has the correct syntax to be like an anchor within the page. Let's see what, oh, actually did work. So yeah, you can like reference different parts of your own page. You could probably do that with DOM manipulation as well, but the more common way of doing it is just with like simple anchor tags. Yeah. But using JavaScript, you could like see how that just jumps instantly down. You could make it so that like it has some cool like smooth scrolling effects with like a CSS animation that gets triggered when you click that, rather than just that instant jump.
So yeah, so like with that animation, like if you wanted to put it like use the DOM manipulation with it, would you reference it from the CSS or straight from that HTML like CSS?
What you would probably do is have a class in your CSS that has a bunch of like has the whole animation written out, because the animations are usually like a number of lines of code. And then what you would do through DOM manipulation is select the appropriate element and have it apply that class so that you can apply a bunch of styles at once. Because what you can do is you can do title.style and dot whatever and keep typing out let's say like font weight equals bold. Got to put that in quotes. So now this is bold. You can essentially apply all sorts of styles, but you can only do like one style per line, and it gets a little like a little verbose to keep typing all this stuff out. But if you had a CSS file and you had a class that had a whole bunch of styles contained within it, then you could like say toggle that class on or off based on clicking a button or something like that, or clicking a link. I would say that's probably the best way to handle applying a bunch of styles at once.
So is that how a theme works? Like if you're on the page and there's like different themes that you can get to like change color, button colors, and
Yeah.
it's laid out, that's how that's gonna work.
Basically, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So you would click that button, and what it would do is that would probably be firing a function that would add and or remove classes from maybe to the whole body, but perhaps to all p tags would get a certain class, and that would change the font, that would change the font weight, change all sorts of things. Apply a similar class to the backgrounds of your sections and change the colors. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And let's look up the. I think it's.
Could you have it set so that you have more than one CSS file, and DOM, you said that also DOM uses like specific nav situations where it changes the whole style of the website based off of it, kind of like the themes, but using DOM templates.
But it switches the CSS file
files
entirely.
So that you can have like a couple different CSS files put in.
I'm not positive. I'd have to look that up. Because I'm not sure if you can select like.
Specific files based off of DOM.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? Let's just see.
I would assume you could make like a class name for each CSS file, or like a generalized one.
Yeah, I'm just so the way like you link in your CSS files usually up in the head, and I'm not sure if you can like select. You might be able to, but I'm just not positive if you can select say one and change like the reference to a different file? You might be able to though. It's a good question. It's worth looking into. You definitely though, like you can have within the same CSS file, you could just have like a block that's sort of contains all the styles that you wanna. Yeah.
Okay, so like depending on what page you're in, it would activate like a different block of CSS. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Okay.
Or like on the like just an initial loadout of a page, you want to have just something like that loads up. That's just something you would have.
Yeah, you just like have a bunch of default styles, and then a bunch of classes written out within that same page that you trigger dynamically through an event. So maybe this is a good time to talk about events. But you can do a lot of other things. Actually, you know what? I want to show you guys a few other ways of selecting things on the DOM. So we're using this get elements by class name, and so we were selecting the title because it has a class. Say we wanted to select something by ID. We could give this paragraph an ID of first paragraph. And then in a similar fashion, we could do var first p equals document dot get element by ID. So you see this one is just get element rather than get elements. And what this means is that like this is only going to return one node from the DOM. So we don't have to access the first index because it's not actually an array. This is just going to be one item at a time since you can only have one unique ID on each page. So if we console log first p, no, oh, first paragraph, I didn't change the ID. So we see now that this is just this first paragraph. It's all of the HTML, including the element tag. If you hover over it in your console, you'll actually see it highlighted on the page there. So we have get elements by class name, which is going to return an array. We have get element by ID, which is just going to return one thing, so we don't have to access the first index like we do with an array. Another way we can do this is we can, if we had multiple classes, you know, like in this first example, if we had multiple classes of title and we wanted to access the second thing that had title, we would just change like the index at which we're accessing the array. We have document.querySelector. So let's do var, I'm going to give this h2 a class as well. Just call it Star Wars. Star Wars title, how about that? So if you do document.querySelector, and you got to do that in camel case. And then you pass in, basically what you pass to query is any CSS selector. So just like in CSS, if you wanted to select something with the class of Star Wars title, you would do dot Star Wars title. This will select the appropriate class. If you're selecting something with an ID, you would use the pound symbol. If you're selecting just an element itself, you do like h2, p. That can get a little dicey because it's only going to return, if you do document.querySelector, the first element that it finds with the p. So like if we leave this one just at p, and then we log Star Wars title variable, we'll get just this first paragraph. So keep in mind, if you're doing querySelector and you're using more generic HTML elements, you're only going to be returning the first one. If you want an array though, we'll call this all Ps. You could do document.querySelector all. And this, similar to get elements by class name, is going to return you an array. So if we do querySelector all P, and then we log that, we're going to see this array of length 3. The first one is the P with the ID of first paragraph. The second two are just are sequentially the other P's. So we have got this one. The second one is the Star Wars paragraph. This third one is the hipster paragraph. So I personally like to use query selector and query selector all to select things, but I want you guys to know that there are other ways of doing it.
If you were trying to target, say, like 2 specific paragraphs, not all of them, would you want to be using something not use query selector or query selector all? Would you want to target more so like a class?
Well, all right, so query selector can work with classes though. But yeah, that's exactly how I would do it. So let's say we wanted to select these second 2 paragraphs. I would give them both the same class. Just give it the class of paragraph. We'll give the second one the class of paragraph as well. And now if we go back to our JavaScript file, if we do var my paragraphs equals document dot query selector all, and then we pass in dot paragraph, that's going to return to us those second 2 paragraphs. So if we log my paragraphs, go back to our console, we have an array of 2 paragraphs now. The first one is the Star Wars paragraph, the second paragraph. The second one is the hipster paragraph, the third one. So yeah, if you want to select a number of elements, I mean, this is essentially, this line here is essentially the same as doing document dot get elements by class name and passing in paragraph here. Bless you. The only real difference between these two is that if you do query selector, you need to include the dot to indicate that you're selecting a class. If you're specifying get elements by class name, you just pass in the actual
It already
name.
knows that it's a
Yeah.
class.
But query selector is a little bit more flexible because you could do paragraph, you could do classes, you could do HTML elements, you could do IDs, although you wouldn't want to do query selector all for IDs because you shouldn't be putting multiple IDs with the same value on the page. Yeah, John.
So obviously by class name, but another thing was like, since it puts it in an array, couldn't you select its index exactly? So like, if you
Yeah.
had 1 and 2 out of all the paragraphs, you could select index 1 and index 2 instead of index 0.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other good thing about, like, sometimes you do want to use an array, right? Or you want to have it in an array because you might want to iterate through the array and do different stuff to it at every point. So right here we have var my paragraphs selecting these last 2 paragraphs. If we wanted to change the style, say you had 12 paragraphs on the page and you wanted to change the style of all of them on a button click or just when the page loads or after a certain amount of time on the page, whatever. For whatever reason you want to change that stuff. So if we log my paragraphs, we see that we have this array of 2. So what we can do in our JavaScript is we can loop through that. So start a for loop. We'll start at index 0. We'll go to the end of my paragraphs. And inside of here, we can do my paragraphs dot style dot background color equals blue. And then if we go back to our page, background color of undefined. Oh, sorry, we have to access it at the right index. So now the first time through the loop, it's going to be selecting the first paragraph that we have stored in this my paragraphs variable. The second time through the loop, it's going to change the color of the third one. So you can, sometimes you do want to be stashing a bunch of nodes in an array so that you can iterate through them in a loop and perform some action on all of them at once, essentially. So when we were talking about like theming, this would be a way that you could select with not too much code, you could select every title on the page and change the color of those titles. You could select every paragraph on the page and change the font size. You could select every section on the page and change the background color. So this is where some of the power of JavaScript and of programming in general comes in, because with basically just a couple lines of code, we can change a bunch of stuff on our actual site. Cool. So I want to show you a little bit about appending, because that's another really important thing that you often do with when you're manipulating the DOM. So I'm going to create an empty section here, and let's append some stuff into this section. All right, well, I'll give it an H2, and we'll just call it empty section for now. So here we have our empty section. It's at the bottom of the page. Let's select this section using one of our methods up here. Which one do you think we should use? Class name, ID, query selector.
ID, because there's only one of them on the page.
Cool, sounds good. We'll do it by ID. Give it an ID of empty. So in our app.js, we'll declare a new variable. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just calling it like the same thing as the class name, basically, for the sake of simplicity.
So the variable names that you're using in the app.js file are local to that file. Like
Yeah.
It's not affecting the HTML whatsoever, right?
Yeah, they're totally arbitrary, these variable assignments. It's just a way to store the appropriate node or nodes from the DOM. Yeah, there's no direct correlation between these variable titles or names and the HTML itself. I'm just going with a convention of, I'm just calling this one in particular empty so that I know basically what I'm trying to access here. So we can do get element by ID. And then if you guys can see here, there are a couple other ways. You can do get elements by name, get elements by tag name. So tag name is like the actual HTML tag, like H1 or P or section or div. And then some elements have a name property also that you can use to select them.
A difference between like get I and get element by ID, because it says that they're the same. So if you
What was
type
the
in
first
just
one?
I, so like if you do get I, it looked like it was short.
Get I?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just yeah.
It is
Oh, in
just
terms of the
shorthand.
in terms of the snippet, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the same. Yeah. So we'll select our node with the ID of empty. Let's log it out to make sure we're grabbing the right thing. Yep, we're getting this H2 down here. Oh, actually, you know what? We want to put this ID on the section itself, because we want to append to this section. And when you append to something, when you basically append just means like attach stuff to it. And where it's going to put stuff, it's going to put it as a child of whatever we've selected. So we want to append stuff that will be children of section and siblings of this H2. We don't want to put more stuff inside the H2 because it's not a container element. So now we see, yeah, we're selecting this section overall. And the syntax for appending is append child. One way you can use it is you can move stuff that's already on the page around. So if we do like, I'm just going to comment out these styles for right now and this loop so it's a little easier to read. If we do empty.append child, this method allows us to attach stuff to the DOM or move stuff around that's already rendered in the DOM. So what we can do with append is we can actually grab, since we already have some of these paragraphs stashed in variables, we could like move one of them from being in one of these sections that we've already rendered and putting them into the empty section. So let's see if we can move this first paragraph around. So if we append first P to our empty div. We go back to our,
So how
now our empty section is filled with the first paragraph.
how does that look in the HTML? Is that
So
it
the-
just looks the same?
So the HTML like in our file is the same, because what has happened is that the browser itself has taken the code from our HTML and then rendered it into the DOM, and then essentially when we manipulate the DOM, we're not manipulating the code in our file directly. But if we go over to this page and we inspect it, and then we look through the HTML here, can you guys see this? I can zoom in a little bit. If we inspect the HTML in here, we see that here's our main, here's where like our stuff lives, and we have these sections. Bacon and meat used to have a P below this H2, but it has been moved down here. So that paragraph with the ID of first paragraph has like actually been taken from the DOM, taken from where it used to be on the DOM, and I'll just draw a new section here. Let's say this was the section that had the ID of empty. We actually took this node, removed it from here, and put it over here. So this one now has that H2 that it had and the P that used to go over there. So we're actually like transforming or transmuting the DOM. What you can also do is you can generate new nodes and then append those. So you can rearrange things as they've already been rendered, or you can create new nodes entirely.
Is that where you were just at? The $sign and the 0 next to that section, is that what's saying that that has been manipulated?
Good question.
Right above bacon and meat, because there's
Yeah.
there's no jQuery running on this. So.
No. You know what? I don't know why that is there. I actually don't know what that $0 represents. Yeah, good question. Yeah, John.
I guess I'm trying to just understand why you would do that instead of just go to the HTML file itself.
Because you can't go to the HTML file itself once your page is loaded. I mean, this is sort of like, these are sort of arbitrary examples right now because we're just manipulating the DOM right after it's loaded. But we're going to talk about events in a minute, and events let you, like, when someone scrolls to a certain distance on the page, or when someone clicks a button on the page, then do something like this. So moving a paragraph around, it's a contrived example just to show you what can be done. But anyone who's using your website or your web app isn't going to be able to manipulate the HTML. This is more for allowing people who are like want to interact with your site to be able to do stuff with it on their side, like on the consumer facing front end.
I have a
Without
reservation,
actually
but
doing
if you
anything.
guys really need this, that's fine.
We could probably find another spot.
It's okay. I'm like a lone soldier, so.
Okay, we'll wrap up as soon as we can. I'll let
that's
you know.
cool.
All right, thanks. So yeah, so you can move stuff around that's already on the DOM, or you can create new things. I think that I gotta look up the syntax for creating new one. Something like create node. Create element. So you can use the document.createElement method, and that will let you create new elements. So let's make a new variable here. Do like var new p or new paragraph equals document dot create element, and then what you pass in here is the tag name of the element you want to create. So this is going to create a new p tag. Right now it's not going to be rendered anywhere because it just sort of exists in memory in our JavaScript. Another way you can manipulate the DOM or manipulate elements beyond like changing style, changing colors and stuff like that is you can change the actual text of something. So the syntax for that, you need to access the variable that we have this element stored in, and you could do dot inner text, and then whatever you put in quotes after that will change the text of it. So this will populate, like this first line here, or line 21 creates a new p tag. Line 22 modifies the actual text of it, because when it's first created, it's just an opening and a closing p tag, nothing in it, so there's nothing to see. Now it still won't be rendered on the page yet because it's just kind of exists in JavaScript memory, but if we change our append child, instead of moving that first paragraph around that we had grabbed up here earlier, if we now change that to new paragraph and append that, we now see in our empty section we have this new paragraph. So you can imagine a more realistic use case where you have some empty space on your page that you're waiting for some kind of user input to make a search or to somehow select what kind of information that they want to see on the page. And then once they have made their selection and they click like a submit button on a form, or they just click a button, maybe you have a few buttons that just have different categories. Once they hit the button, then the page like loads up all the relevant content. And then if they click another button, the page empties and then reloads that content. So creating new elements, you can use create element. Inner text is particularly good for paragraphs, H1s, any kind of text. There's also an inner HTML method, and what that does in this case, it's going to function pretty much the same as inner text. Since this is a p tag, all that goes within it is text. But if you had a section and you wanted to add in an H2 to it and a paragraph and an H3 after that and maybe some nested stuff in there, essentially if you wanted to add a whole bunch of elements at once, you can write like actual valid HTML in here. So you could do you can like open up a tag and this is my title, and then you could open close it down, and then you could open up like a paragraph and write like some text for a paragraph in there. Now adding inner HTML to just a p tag doesn't make a lot of sense, but if you had a div or a section or an article and you wanted to append a whole like actual written out HTML in there, this is how you do that. You do .inner HTML, and then whatever code you've written in there will get loaded up and rendered in the DOM, not just as text, but with the actual tags.
So then create element, you have it just set to do a paragraph, correct?
Yeah.
But you could have it set to say section.
Yeah.
Div.
Yeah, let's just do it with like a div. We'll comment this out. And so if we do, we'll append a H2 and a P. And so now we have an H2 and a paragraph have been added to the empty section. So we're going to teach you guys something called template strings, which make it really easy to do like many lines of essentially like break your strings out onto many lines, make them easier to write, because you can use these kind of append statements and sort of like almost format your code like you would format your HTML. Now the way to do that without template strings is to just like concatenate them with plus signs, right? So if you have like a bunch of lines to do this with, it can get a little bit cumbersome. Oops. And you have to have like plus signs. You have to make sure like the white space doesn't matter, but this is easier to read, right? we'll introduce you guys to something called template strings that make doing multi-line concatenation a lot easier. But don't worry about that for now. I just wanted to mention it.
And so you said like kind of like the main application, like where this would be used, like I guess is just like if you wanted your user to kind of, I don't know, have a more UX experience with your page. You know?
Yeah. Well, so like I have a side project going on that's like a wildlife website. So I essentially want the user to have the same view whether they're looking at, and it has a lot of pictures on it. So you can look at pictures of elephants or lions or whatever, birds, and the overall like view for each of those is basically the same. So at the top you have like a big image of one of those animals. Below it you have like a description of them, and below that is like a whole gallery with a bunch more images you can click on. So using this kind of DOM manipulation, it essentially made it so that without having to rewrite the same page over and over and over again and have a separate HTML page for everything, you make it so that you can dynamically populate all those pieces of sort of like the overall template with whatever you need. So if the user clicks on elephants, then it hits the server, gets the first image of the elephant, puts that as the biggest one. It gets the description of elephants and populates the paragraph with those. And then it populates the gallery of images of elephants below that with all the rest of the elephant pictures. It does the same thing if the user chooses lions or birds or fish or whatever. So if you weren't able to use JavaScript for any of this stuff, you'd have to like rewrite that same page for every animal you wanted to have on your site, for every description you wanted to have. A much better way of doing it is to create like essentially a template for that page and then use JavaScript to request information, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. We're going to go over AJAX, which is how do I talk to a server? How do I talk to, whether it's a server I wrote myself or a server that someone else wrote, and like get information back. So like imagine a site like Facebook where they have like literally like billions of users at this point. Imagine if you had to write an HTML page and a CSS page for every single user, right? That would be pretty much impossible. So the way they handle that is that they have essentially like, they still have a bunch of HTML pages written, but you know, you have your profile view. Everyone's profile looks the same. Like you can't really customize it much. You can customize it a little bit, but every profile is pretty much the same, and all that's changing is the data that's being displayed. So when you go to your profile on Facebook, you see the image that you uploaded for your profile pic, and you see all the stuff from your feed, from your friends. When Dan logs into his Facebook, he sees the image that he uploaded as his profile picture. So JavaScript is a huge part of why that kind of stuff is possible, so that you don't have to like be duplicating the same code over and over and over again. So sort of
just like using loops and DOM manipulation,
essentially, yeah. And they have, you know, they've got a massive amount of data stored in their servers and databases. And what's happening is when I log into my Facebook, request is being made to their servers, and then the server makes a request to their database, gets the right data, sends it all the way back to me on the front end, and renders my profile, my particular profile page out using the appropriate images, the appropriate text, the appropriate like feed, all that stuff. So when that page, like the actual HTML that they've written for a profile page is actually very, very generic. And then they're rendering a lot of stuff dynamically using JavaScript. All right, cool. Let's talk about events, because I think this helps ties it together a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of this styling stuff. I'll just leave it there, actually. Just create some new space here. So one of the events are probably one of the most common ways to actually give someone the ability to like interact with your page. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this link, and we're going to throw a couple buttons up at the top here that will let us change different things on the page. So where is that link in the HTML? All right, let's get rid of this. And I'm going to add a button up here. Yeah. Call it red. And I'm going to give it an ID of a red button. So we have this little button. Right now it doesn't do anything. But if we go to our JavaScript and let's stash that button in a variable. So we'll do var red button equals document dot. I'm going to use query selector for this one. You could also definitely do get element by ID. And I'm going to do get me the element with the ID of red button. I believe that's what I called it. Yep. So this is going to return this particular node on the DOM of this button. And now that we have it stored in a variable, let's do some stuff with it. I'm just going to organize this a little bit better. So an event is essentially attaching attaching a listener. So events are composed of two main things. We have the event listener, which is you can listen for lots of different kinds of events. Click is probably the most common. So you can attach, we're going to attach something, an event to this button that's waiting for someone to click on it. You can have events that get triggered on key presses. You can have events that get triggered on a touch screen if someone touches, you can have scroll events. So if someone scrolls past a certain length on your site, something triggers. There's a whole bunch of things that can trigger events. And there's a bunch of links in the daily, I'm not sure if it's in the daily plan from yesterday or the units like from the lecture from yesterday on events that you can check them out. There's tons and tons of different types of events. Let me just grab some of those from the unit right here. Click events are like some of the most common by far though. Like I think most of the events that I end up writing are click events.
Like mouse over.
Oh yeah, mouse over,
Okay.
mouse out. So when someone like drags their mouse inside of an element on the page or drags their mouse out of it. Yeah.
Because we're talking about that, like with the click events, is there a difference between the click event and like? Because it's like my other computer, it's a 2-in-1, so I have the ability
To
tap
touch?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is there a difference? Like, do you have to have that actually set up so it can register them as the same thing, or does it read it as touch and click are the same thing?
I think that, there definitely are touch events that are different. I think that by default, you can trigger click events with a touch also.
Okay.
But there's because you can touch and drag, and there are different here. It's touch start, so sent when the user places a touch point on the touch surface. So it's will be the element in which they first touched. Touch end would be the element where their touch ends. Touch move is when they're moving through an element, I believe. And there's touch cancel. So just touching directly on a link or something, I believe counts as a click as well. But there are also certain events that are specific to touch. And you guys can check out the docs to learn more about that stuff. But, all right, so we have this button stashed in a variable. So let's access it with that variable and add an event listener to it. So we can do red button, and then the method that you want to use is add event listener. This method, this function takes two arguments. The first argument is the type of event that you want to listen for. So in this case, we're going to listen for a click event. The second argument that this event takes is a function. And this is essentially the block of code that you want to run when this element has been clicked on. So this code does not run at all until the button is clicked. So what should we do with this button? Let's just do something really basic at first. Let's change the color of the button itself. So red button dot style dot background color equals orange. So when we go back to our page, when it loads, everything looks pretty standard. When we click on this button, the button itself turns orange. So we could write it so that when you click on this button, all of the paragraphs turn bold or change background color or something like that. This is where I think the DOM manipulation starts to come more into focus, because as we talked about, it doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense to just load up the DOM and then change a bunch of stuff on the DOM. You could just do it in the HTML or the CSS beforehand. It makes a lot more sense to have some stuff for the user to interact with that will manipulate the DOM in one way, shape, or form. So similarly, we could have another button up here, and we can call this blue button and change its text to blue. We can select it in a very similar way that we selected the red button. I'm just going to copy, change this to blue, and let's add another listener to the blue button. Oh, I need to change this variable. So now we can do blue button dot add event listener, do another click handler, and declare a function, anonymous function, because this function doesn't have a name. And now whatever code we put in here will change everything. So let's select the paragraphs that we've stored in my paragraphs and change something with those. My paragraphs. So we can do my paragraphs dot style dot color equals blue. So now we have this red button. All it does, I don't know why I made the red button change its own color to orange, but there you have it. We have the red button that changes its own color, and we have a blue button that does nothing. Let's see if we have an error. Cannot set property color of undefined. Huh. Let's log my paragraphs and see if that's actually grabbing what we think it is. Oh, well, the reason it's not working is because we're trying to change the color of an array. Let's log it though. Yeah, so we have this array of two things. So what we can do is use similar code that we did before with that loop. So within our event handler, we can do a for loop. We'll start it at index 0, go to my paragraphs.length, and at each point in the loop, we'll do my paragraphs at index I, so whatever the current value of the loop of I in the loop is, and then chain style.color equals blue. So now, when we click this button, now these paragraphs turn blue. We refresh the page. We're back where we started. My computer's going to die soon. Do any of you guys have a charger? Oh. These tables are kind of annoying. This particular one. All right. So, whoa,
They changed the text to blue.
that's crazy. Not what I was expecting. Oh, it's because I commented out this loop, or I re-enabled that loop. That was the background color. Yeah, so now this will just change the text to blue. So you can see how using these kind of events, you can make your site very dynamic. Like you could have some content on your site hidden until the user scrolls to a certain place and then it like fades in. You could have stuff fade out depending on where you've scrolled. Depending on what you're clicking on, you can have animations firing, you can have content changing, you can have style changing. There's a whole lot of stuff you can do with it. Do you guys have any questions?
Actually, I do have a question. So,
Yeah.
Just really quick, if you go back up to the variables,
Yeah.
what is when you do the query selector for the buttons, why do you put a hashtag in front of the,
Oh yeah, so when you do query selector, you select elements in your HTML as if you were using like CSS. So in CSS, you put a hashtag before for IDs in order to select IDs. If for classes, you put a dot before them. So yeah, I'm using that hash and then red button because that's the ID. Yeah,
We only have to do that on query
for
selector.
query selector and query selector all.
Okay.
You can also just put in like HTML elements themselves, like P or H2.
But if you're
targeting
a specific ID,
ID, you use the hash. If you're targeting a specific class, you use the dot.
okay.
I personally like using query selector, but it's not inherently any better or worse than get element by ID or get elements by class name. In fact, those might be less confusing right now because it's so specific. It's all right, ID, get element by ID. So this is going to be one element, and it's going to have the ID that I pass to it. With classes, it's going to be an array because it's elements, and it's going to be, and what I have to give it is a class name. It's really up to you guys. And once you get a little bit more into jQuery, jQuery is a different syntax for selecting things also. jQuery adheres more to the query selector syntax. So if you're selecting an ID, you use the hash. If you're selecting a class, you use the dot. If you're selecting just an HTML element, you put just the element's tag name in.
What are those called? Like, what is a query selector and then get elements by ID, get elements by class name? Like, what is the technical term for that?
For like this document dot query selector.
Yeah, I mean, not even necessarily the document part, but just
The queries, it's a method, which
Okay.
is just a function that's attached to an object. So we're accessing the document object, and then we're accessing the query selector method on it. And all methods are functions. Method and function are fairly interchangeable. The difference is that a method is a function that's attached to an object. So just like you can attach properties like a key value pair, like name Dan to an object, you can also attach functions to objects. So when you hear the word method, all that means is a function that's attached to an object. So that's the reason why we have document in front of all of these. It's because the document object has a ton of methods on it. So the DO part of DOM, this is sort of the model here. The tree is more of the model. The document object is this massive object that exists in the browser that has all of these methods built into it. So it's just a bunch of functions. This is sort of the API part of it. So an API is something that lets you, as a developer, as a programmer, interface with something else. So one of the things that we call the DOM, we say the DOM is an API. One of the things it is an API. This is the API part of it. It gives us all of these methods, all of these functions that let us actually interact with it. So we're going to learn about Ajax tomorrow, and we're going to learn how to access external site APIs. So we're going to learn how to get data from like Facebook or Spotify or any of these like big companies that offer up some chunk of their data for other people to use.
So like attaching like Google Maps to your page.
Yeah.
Is that how that would work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what we're going to do for our Q1 projects is one of the requirements is going to be that you have to hit an external API. You're going to have to figure out the right syntax to interact with it, and request some data from it, get that data back, and then render it on the page through DOM manipulation. And actually, the project that we do at the end of this week is like a smaller scale practice of that stuff too. Any other questions? I know it's a lot of stuff.
Did you record this?
Yeah, it's recorded. That's part of why I wanted to plug in too, because I didn't want it to die.
Yeah, like because there was like parts of it like it would like
There
go
were
blank.
bits where I didn't see what you were doing for a couple minutes. Like,
Oh, really?
It just froze up, and I would just sit here like trying to look over here, see if he's still running. Occasionally, he was running where I was, and
Yeah.
I was just
Every time it happened to me, I was like, I can see you guys looking at each
Yeah,
other.
I was like looking over here. I was like trying to like I don't know mess around with the Slack and see if